Hi, I'm Jamie. This is Dead Dodge Garage, and this is still Dylan's Dart Sport. If you're not familiar with this car, I do have a whole playlist on it to get you up to speed. The Cliff Notes version is it was an original slant 6 automatic car, and I am swapping it for the owner Dylan to a stroked Magnum engine, a 408 cubic inch unit, a 5-speed TKX, a Dana 60 rear end, 4-wheel disc brakes, and other goodies. To that end, I ripped out the old slant 6, which was making some very interesting noises, and just about everything else mechanical too. The 7 1/4 axle is still hanging in it for now. That'll be out soon. I've had the vast majority of parts necessary to finish this project in a pile here in the shop for quite some time. Recently, Dylan visited the shop, and we spent some time going through all of that. It's now sorted into sections for engine stuff, suspension stuff, etc. Today I'm working on the front suspension and brakes of the car. We've got a mountain of parts for that job right here, although until recently, there were a good few things missing. Those missing parts are now here in a pile I just received in a box from Firmfeel. So that's great. We've got new ball joints, new tie rod ends, new steering arms, new bushings. We've got everything we're gonna need to get the front end of this thing nice, fresh, and happy. I started the teardown on this a couple weeks ago and then decided to wait until the rest of the parts got here to finish it. As you can see, I did some mild degreasing on the K-frame, but it's still pretty bad. I'm gonna get the rest of this broken down and removed, and then I will give that another cleaning and we'll paint it. Because I've already started the job, this isn't exactly a 100% teardown guide. Just know, to get it to this point, all I had to do was loosen the upper ball joint nuts, beat those with a hammer to get them free, loosen the outer tie rod nuts, tap those with a hammer to get them free, and then remove the strut rod nuts and front bushing and the lower control arm pin nut. Now the whole section of suspension there is slid back and ready to remove. Where I'm at now is separating the lower ball joints from the control arms. As mentioned, I generally separate joints like this with a hammer. Now the hammer technique I'm talking about does not involve beating the stud with a hammer. It's shocking the taper here. A few quick heavy raps should do the trick, and it shouldn't damage the taper, so you should be fine reusing it later. But in some cases that won't do the trick, and you'll have to use a separator of some kind. You can use a pickle fork, or you can use one of the press type tools. Once the two knuckles are free, I will pull these lower arms. Then I will unbolt the idler arm and loosen the pitman arm from the gearbox. I'll have to smack that with a hammer or use a puller tool on that as well. I'll be reusing this center link. Generally, they're just fine. There are no joints in those, just the 4 tapers, so we'll attach all the new parts to that. With all that done, the last thing attached to the K-frame will be the power steering gearbox and the attached slant 6 pump, which I don't think we'll be reusing. It's simply held on with 3 bolts over here. We will not be reusing this gearbox. We'll be using a Firmfeel box. I'm pretty sure it's a stage 2. Now the Firmfeel is built in one of these standard assemblies. The other choice would have been a Borgeson box, which is a little smaller and lighter, but frankly, I'm not a fan of those. We had originally discussed converting this thing to manual steering, and that could have worked too, but I really like that Firmfeel box. You get good road feel out of it, but you're still able to steer the car in parking lots, and that's kind of nice. Now, before I actually dive in on this, I do have a couple more notes. First, my brother and I did a video quite some time ago demonstrating a lot of these same operations on a Barracuda. We did upper control arm bushings and ball joints in that video. We didn't do a full front end rebuild, so that's what you're getting here. Hopefully, this is a concise guide that shows you the entire process. Though there's a bit of variation in the hard parts, the process is essentially exactly the same for any A-body, 1960 to 1976. And it's not just A-bodies either. For example, if you want to overhaul the front end on your B-body, the process is almost exactly the same. Your mileage may vary on other body styles. For example, C-bodies and 73 and up B-bodies use a different style lower control arm. To get the suspension to this point, I removed the torsion bars by loosening the torsion bar adjusters, and then I took out all 4 K-frame bolts and disassembled everything else attached to the car to drop the whole thing out like this. You could do all of this with the suspension still in the car, but it's so much easier with it sitting on a cart in front of you. And a word to the wise. The upper ball joints on these A and B bodies and the lower ball joints on the C bodies and the late B bodies are threaded in. You use a special socket to grab this thing and spin it out. It's a really good idea to loosen this while it's still attached to the car. Because I didn't do that, I'm now going to have to put this in a vise, and hopefully that'll work. Of course, this car came from California, so I haven't really had issues with hardware coming loose. Just saying, you really ought to loosen that while your control arms are still attached. On this particular K-member, I also have to modify it to fit a V8. I'm going to do a whole separate video on a slant 6 to V8 conversion, but just know that part of this operation will also be cutting down that tower and re-drilling some holes. As mentioned, a lot of the disassembly here can be done with a hammer, but tools like this, tie rod separators, pitman arm pullers, these can be a huge asset in finishing this project. Before I do anything else here, I have got to sort through this mess and hopefully find the good hammer. Much better. And I found the hammer, so I can now demonstrate the pickle fork technique for separating these things. Note, the pickle fork, as it's called, is just a tapered wedge. It needs to be suited correctly to the size of the joint you're working on. There are bigger ones, there are smaller ones. This one seems about right, but there's really not much room to get it in here, so I don't know if this is going to work well or not. Anyway, you get it started there in the gap, and then you beat it savagely with a hammer. Whoop! And try not to break your own elbows. What a pain. All right, we'll go back to the hammer technique. Note in this case, I am just going to smack the stud because I really can't get in there in any other way. Wow. Just had to shut off the camera and give it a good smack. Now again, I am not reusing these ball joints because they're total trash. If you are, don't do that. Get one of the puller tools in there. And there's the right knuckle drum assembly off. Since we won't be using any of this in the rebuild, I'm just going to set these off to the side somewhere. Our fancy new factory type brake kit came with knuckles, brackets for the calipers, shields obviously, every bit of hardware we're going to have new. A quick note on that, because this is a later car, a 74, this thing uses the larger upper ball joint size. If this was an earlier A-body, 72 and down, the drum brake cars use a small ball joint, and we wouldn't be able to use these control arms with that disc brake setup. But the late cars, you're good to go. That also means I can't just grab these 10-inch drum brakes and slap them on one of my early A-bodies, because I'll have to change the upper A-arm, just like you have to do in most disc brake swaps. With that off, now I can do this. Maybe. Come on. I might need more hands. Because two studs are going in two different places at two different angles, this can be a little tricky. Here's one lower control arm and strut rod assembly. We're actually replacing the strut rods with fancy aftermarket type rods as well, so there's another piece we won't be reusing. Really the only thing we are reusing here, the arm and the pin. Anyway, on this side, the bushings were actually kind of okay. Here's the inner strut rod bushing, and here's a look at the lower control arm bushing. This is what's usually completely trashed on these Mopars. Interesting, even the driver's side lower bushing really isn't that bad. There's still rubber in there, the pin is still solid, and it's centered in the hole. Incidentally, the upper bushings on this car were some of the worst I've ever seen. I don't know what the deal is there. I don't know how the lowers could have survived and the uppers didn't. Unless they were replaced at some point, but that's not very common. Note, this car had a bent strut rod on the driver's side, which also is not totally uncommon, although I can't say I've ever seen it on an A-body before. I've seen it on a B-body and a full-size car. Now I'm pulling the pitman arm off the box so I can knock that thing off. Note I've got it rigged up there against the pitman arm with the pitman arm nut removed. That thing's something like 34 millimeter. I don't know what it is in American. I didn't have a socket big enough, but one of my CV sockets did work. Anyway, I've got the puller tool rigged up there, and I've got this handy 1/2-inch electric ratchet impacty thingy, which may or may not have enough beef to get this done. Yeah, maybe not. An impact would do fine, or I can grab a big ratchet handle and brace the whole K-frame in place. Hold on to your butts! Yay. With the pitman off and the 3/4-inch hex bolts out of the gearbox, this whole assembly can just be lifted off and set up over there to dribble fluid probably. Make sure your gearbox bolts get torqued correctly. I have seen those loose many times, and believe it or not, it can make your car not handle the best. Those are special bolts. They look like this. It's a big thread, 7/16 course, or is it bigger than that? They have those tall heads and the special washers that actually fit inside the gearbox, so don't lose those either. And now I've got the idler arm loose. It's the last piece of hardware attached to this K-frame. There's the special bolt for that. We're definitely not going to lose that. Needs to have the proper shoulder to locate that thing. A note here. This idler arm is actually tight in the K-frame. Oftentimes, replacement ones aren't. It's really tight. Anyway, pay attention to the fact that there is a washer sitting on top of the bushing there, and I think there's actually one on the bottom too. You want to make sure that the idler arm and stack of washers or spacers fully fill this gap. Otherwise, when you go to tighten the bolt down, it's going to pinch the opening in the K-frame and it won't contact the idler right. You can end up with play right there, and it's not great. This configuration just has the one thick washer on the top. Again, you want to pay attention to that. You probably just want to match that when you reinstall the new one, but your aftermarket arm may be different, so keep this in mind. It's 2 hours later, and yeah, I called that one. I don't even know where it's leaking from. Yeah, there somewhere, I guess. Now that it's stripped, it's time to degrease, and then degrease, and then degrease some more. And then we'll do the modifications for the engine mount. Now, degreasing the engine compartment, that was a job. This is a horrible, messy nightmare that I really wish I had not started on my poor cart there. That carpet's gonna have to be burned now. Not quite ready for paint, but we're getting there. Ugh. This thing must have leaked everything from everywhere forever. Hours. I have been working on this for hours. It's not perfect, but it is pretty good. I think it's pretty good enough. Other than this, I gotta take this off. It's super tough to clean around all this horrible weld splatter, which does remind me of something. This K-frame, like the rest of the car, was built by Chrysler. And as such, the quality in places is not stellar. I have read about people going around these things and cleaning them up, re-welding all the seams with a MIG welder, just going around and making sure everything is decent. I've never bothered with that before, and I'm not going to change today. If you're going for absolute perfection, or the closest you can have to perfection with a Chrysler product, go ahead and do that. But me, I think this will do just fine. The finish is another place you can very easily outdo the factory. If you're concerned about that, send your K-frame out to be sandblasted and powder coated. I've seen several K-frames done that way, and it's very nice. Me, I'm gonna splash some flat black on here just as crappily as the factory did, and it'll eventually flake off. But, you know, that's the Chrysler way. Before that, again, I do need to get the modifications done on this driver's side perch. I need to measure down an inch from the bottom of this slot and center a hole. It's gonna end up right about here. Once the hole is drilled, I'll come through and cut this off, cut those top ears off, and just generally dress this up. One entire forever later. You know what? It's not just good, it's good enough. Now I'm degreasing it again. Have I already said this isn't a restoration? I just couldn't leave this thing as nasty as it was. So it's gonna be way, way better. K-frame painted. While the paint dries, I'm getting my assembly area cleaned up here. It's better. Now I can dive into redoing some of these components. I'm gonna start with the most annoying part first. Well, maybe the second most annoying part. Anyway, the lower control arm. The first thing I need to do here is knock this strut rod out. As mentioned, it's bent. I've got the nut loosened here, and I'm just gonna smack this thing. Maybe a couple times. Maybe I'll put it in a vise or hold it or something. Yeah, I just had to turn the camera off, and then it was literally one hit. Now, I need to remove this pin. That is what locates the lower control arm. This is the pivot point for the entire suspension on the bottom. Couple notes here. First, I own a hydraulic press, and if you own a hydraulic press or have access to one, it can make most of these operations a whole lot easier. But then you have to rig the piece up in the hydraulic press, and that I find very irritating. So I choose to do as much of this as I can with a hammer and hand tools. Right now, we're getting out this pivot pin. We do not want to disturb the bushing around it if at all possible. I'm going to show you techniques for dealing with that in a minute. And note, the removal of that bushing is going to vary by what bushing you're putting back in. I'll explain. First, I'm going to drive out this pin, hopefully with a brass drift and a big hammer. Nah, that didn't work on this one, probably because the bushing's actually still in one piece. But what is working is grabbing the pin with the vise and just turning the control arm around on it. Note, you can't go that way because the adjuster arm comes out, but doing this and putting light upward pressure on it, it's slowly coming out. After a bit of fiddling, I'm left with this, the pin still held in the vise and the control arm. Now here's something important. Note, the original inner metal sleeve is still on the pin. this would have been part of the bushing that was installed in there. Do not remove that if you're going to use polyurethane lower control arm bushings, which I recommend you do. Here's the poly bushing. Here's the inner diameter of the poly bushing. And here it is installed on that original metal bushing. You need that. Don't cut it off of there. Another note here. If your lower control arm bushing was totally wasted, this sleeve may have been damaged by metal on metal contact. Hopefully it's intact-ish. A little bit of damage wouldn't be too big of a deal. If it's super bad, you may need to break out the welder and a grinder, some sandpaper, a file, etc. and make sure that is smooth-ish. Now in the control arm side, we are left with the rubber insert in place. If this was wasted, I could probably just grab it out of there, but at this point, I may need to set it on fire. No, I'm not joking. That's usually how we do this. Before I set it on fire and make all kinds of horrible, noxious smells, I thought I'd try the flathead screwdriver technique, and I actually did get it all the way down behind that thing. Your mileage may vary. It may be well adhered to that outside metal sleeve, but mine seems to be coming off. So I'm going to monkey with this off camera. We'll see how it goes. It popped right out. No problem. And we're left with that original outer shell still in place in the arm. This is seriously like best case scenario. It does not normally go this well or look this good. Here's your other important note. And I have read about people messing this up. This is why I mention it. Leave that outer shell in place too. Do not remove that. All you're doing is getting rid of the rubber section. Now again, this only applies if you're going to use the polyurethane lower control arm bushing, but you really should. The rubber ones are usually in pieces. These things last much better, much longer. And aside from the difficulty you can see here, it pretty much just installs by hand and you're done, which is way better than the stupid rubber setup. There it is driven home. Note, I did not lubricate that. I installed that dry. I'll tell you why. Here is an original type rubber bushing. Obviously it's new. If it wasn't new, it would be totally destroyed. Note, there's an inner sleeve and an outer sleeve, and they are attached to that rubber. In this design, nothing moves per se. It doesn't move mechanically. It flexes. This thing is what locates your suspension. This thing has to flex every time this control arm moves up and down. And it does that thousands of times every time you drive your car. So, small wonder these bushings wear out over time. The poly bushing is completely different in its operation. This poly material does not flex. I mean, I don't know, it flexes a little bit, but it's pretty solid. What's happening in this design is there's an allowance for movement here on the inside. That sleeve on the pin actually rotates inside this piece. That's why you've got those grooves. Those are going to hold grease and help lubricate that pin as it rotates in there. In theory, this could pretty much hold up forever, at least until all the grease disappears and the poly starts wearing out. It's a much better arrangement than the factory rubber, and because it doesn't wear out so quickly, it will keep that pin located. It'll prevent your front end from wandering and getting loose. This is a good deal. But again, the inside has grooves for grease to allow for that movement. The outside does not. You don't want the outside of this shell moving. You want all that bearing action taking place on the inside. So now it's time to lubricate this pin, and probably the bushing a little bit, and install. As mentioned, I did have to go buy some silicone-based lubricant, which is what you want to use for these poly bushings. For some reason, this kit didn't come with any. That's not normal. Apply liberally. If you don't, this thing will squeak like crazy. You don't want that. Also note the replacement bushing is taller than the original, so that poly bushing is actually going to extend to about here onto this other OD that is not part of that sleeve. I did lubricate that too, but it's ever so slightly smaller, so I don't know how well it contacts. Anyway. Alright, I gotta use two hands to do that, but you just put it in there and then you're done. If we were doing the rubber type, we'd be using a press right now. Did I mention how much that sucks? And we're home. While you're working on this, here's something else to check. These control arms are made out of 2 chunks of stamped steel that are stuck together. They're riveted here, and they're roughly held together by the bump stop plate. Back here, there's not much to hold them together, and so occasionally this section loosens up, and then this can actually move around in there. It's Not too bad on this one, but I am going to pop this in the vise real quick and just squeeze it tight. If you want the ultimate beef for your lower control arms, do that, and then get a set of the weld-on brace plates. They go right here with a hole for the torsion bar adjuster bolt, and they firm these arms up substantially. We only do that on the most extreme of handling cars. Of course, I got excited and did things out of order here. Now I'm going to clean and paint this thing. So I'll protect my shiny new parts and knock the big chunks off, get a little bit of black paint on it. It'll be fine. No one will ever see it, but if you poke your head under there, it'll look new-ish until it gets driven a few hundred miles and caked in dirt again. Well, that's interesting. That appears to be undercoating. These parts weren't supposed to be painted from the factory. They were dipped in Cosmoline, which kind of sort of protected them from rusting for a while. There you go. It's not perfect, like everything else I'm doing here today, but it's pretty good. If you want to do a really, really nice job here, take those over to the dunk tank for 20 minutes and then sandblast them, and then paint them, and then do all this, and then touch up the paint, and that'll be great. But this is not that job. While the paint on the first one dries, now I'll do all the same stuff to the other side. I've got the pin out of this other lower bushing, and on this one you actually can see it's kind of worn off center there. Yeah, weight of the car is sitting on these, and as mentioned, they cycle many, many times, so it's very common to see this. Often, when you look up, when this thing is still in the car, you'll see it shifted off toward one side, and that's why. Second pin installed. Here's our control arm. Here's that pin you saw me putting in the new bushing, which of course lives in here. I've got this together. This is just snug, or actually a little less than snug now. Now I've got this fancy firm feel strut rod installed. This is a 3-piece adjustable setup. It's a lot like a tie rod sleeve. You can loosen these jam nuts, which I had to do to get this all together, and then you can spin the center sleeve, and that effectively changes the length of the strut rod. Now I will tell you, I've never bothered with this step before. I've always just used the factory strut rods. Of course, we had a bent one here, so we had to change them anyway, and Dylan opted for some nice fancy adjustable ones. The only set I've dealt with previously was on the Red 71 Challenger. On that brand, which was not firm feel, they might be Hotchkiss. Can't remember. Anyway, their instructions explicitly say you cannot adjust this to put tension on the arm and try and affect your alignment. Some GM cars are aligned that way, but Mopars are not. Now you could, if you were so inclined, preload this to pull the control arm forward, but it may put the lower control arm bushing into a bind and cause it to prematurely wear out. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to adjust this to the perfect length such that the arm is sitting centered straight at a 90-degree angle and everything's all happy. Now, of course, once this thing is on the car, there's a wheel here and there's weight on this arm and the suspension is compressed. The length it needs to be may change. So I'm not torquing anything for now. I'm just kind of setting it together. Here is our new strut rod bushing with the new washers that are supplied. It might look like this is installed backwards. You might expect the cup to go toward the bushing to capture it, but that is not the case. These washers are specifically labeled to go this way. The factory setup looks very much like that. So this is the forward one, and here's the inside one. The reason they're oriented like that is because as the suspension goes through its travel, the washer will shift on this bushing somewhat. As you know, the adjusting bolt for the torsion bar is down here. You would have had to loosen that to get to this point. This is the arm that is actuated by that thing. If you torque this pin down, you'll no longer be able to move the arm. You want to make sure it's still loose, and before this whole assembly goes back in, you want to make sure that is all the way down, such that the socket for the torsion bar is rotated fully that way on the other side, and you can get the torsion bar started in its hex socket. You don't want to torque any hardware at this stage. You just want these things snug to hold everything together. Once this is in the car, you've got wheels out here and there is weight on the suspension. That's complete vehicle weight, which means you really want the engine installed as well. You want to get your ride height set where you want it, bounce the vehicle, roll the vehicle a few times, make sure that's good, and then fully torque all of the hardware to the factory specs. Dude, Tropic Thunder's free on YouTube! And now we're here. It's also quite a while later, but don't worry about that. Both lowers and strut rods are in, snug down, and ready for further assembly. The next step is to get the lower ball joints attached to the knuckles and get those hanging on there. One small annoyance here. We're using a disc brake conversion kit. It's actually essentially the factory pieces that would have been on one of these cars if it had disc brakes. Of course, this one was an original small bolt pattern drum brake car. This is also getting us the big 5-on-4.5 bolt pattern, the same one Ford used and the same one used on B-bodies. Unfortunately, this shiny new knuckle did not come with the bolts to attach the shiny new ball joint. I'm going to have to tear the old drum brakes apart just to get that. A quick note about those disc brake spindles. These are essentially reproductions of the factory pieces, and that's great. They actually are reversible. We're going to install this with the caliper to the rear so we can make extra room for a sway bar at the front. Judging by the fact that they labeled this L, they figured we'd be doing that anyway. But generally speaking, in a factory application, the caliper would have been mounted to the front. Drum brake number 1, gutted for 2 bolts. Now they're here, holding the ball joint and the spindle together. Those definitely need to be torqued to spec because they support like the whole weight of the car. I don't necessarily know what that spec is right offhand. I'm going to guess by the size of that bolt, 85, 90 foot-pounds, maybe even more than that. You're going to want to consult a service manual, which I'll do in a little bit here. Check it out. Knuckles installed. And I've got the shocks hanging in place as well. I will have to carefully align those as the K-member goes up. You can install them later too, but this is slightly easier. Yeah, now it's time for the part I've been putting off. Upper control arms. I've got to get those threaded ball joints threaded out with the special socket. Hopefully I can find that. Then I also have to press out the bushings and try really hard not to ruin the control arms. Everything in the upper control arm is really what was wrong here. Also, this thing's caked in mud, so that's good. I knocked the inner washer out, and I can just remove this by hand. I have never seen that, ever. I'm gonna spray around here, and hopefully some penetrant will help remove this thing. I may smack it with a hammer, but I'll probably have to go for the ball joint press to finish this job. When my brother and I were first doing front ends on Mopars like over a decade ago, we concocted this tool we'd seen on the internet. It was a chunk of all thread with some big washers and some large nuts. You would use that and like a socket of appropriate size, tighten it down and squish the bushing out, then flip it all around and squish the new one back in. This ball joint toolkit includes this giant C-clamp. This is actually the perfect tool for doing these bushings. All you need is some kind of receiver cup on the other side, and this is like perfectly sized to push this bushing through, at least when it's a whole bushing. Not so much when it's just the sleeve here. This I could probably just cut with a Sawzall and smack with a hammer. I want to tell you about something we totally missed out on last time we did this, which resulted in ruining a control arm. And it's this extra reinforcing sleeve on the outside of the bushing. You're not going to find these in all positions. You may not even see them at all on some cars. We weren't familiar with this, and we've been doing it for years. Anyway, it's around the rear bushing on this driver's side. I don't remember if the passenger side has one or not. But you need to make sure you're pressing in here and not on this outer sleeve. If you're pushing against this outer sleeve, you're going to mess up the control arm, and that's not going to be fun. Well, the bushings are kind of sort of coming out easily, actually. But it's time to quit for the night. I gotta go eat soup, so we'll get back to this nightmare later. Wow, it's a really, really long time later, like 2 months? Yeah, something like that. Anyway, I'm finally getting back to this whole front end rebuild, upper control arm, ball joint thing. I couldn't find my ball joint sockets. Turns out they were right where they should be. That would be the problem. Anyway, if you don't know, the ball joints on these Mopars, on the upper control arms at least, are threaded in. So you have to use the correct socket, which locks around the ball joint. It is a 3/4 drive in this case, so there's an adapter that I dropped. Sometimes these are very, very stubborn. And sometimes, well, they just kind of move. And that's what this one's doing, so that's good news. Perhaps some spray. Make sure you remove the boot before you try to thread that out. Yeah, a little bit of PB Blaster did wonders on that. It basically spun right out. Took a bit of work. I already knocked the big chunks off this control arm. I think I'm contractually obligated to clean it up a little bit more before I finish this job. Do need to knock these old shells out from the bushings first. Yet again, because this thing's from California, everything just comes apart. It's way too easy. Your mileage will definitely vary on that. The last time we did this job on the channel, it was me and my brother in a video called A Very Chaotic Mopar A-Body Suspension Upgrade Video. Something like that. That video still gets views and comments from time to time. One I got like just yesterday was, I was thinking about overhauling my Mopar's front end, but now I think I'll just take a nap or something to that effect. Anyway, things are going much better this time. During the course of deciding what we were going to do with this car, Dylan and I were discussing the upper control arm options. So you can rebuild these stock pieces with some choice parts, or you can spend a ton of money and get tubular uppers. Now the tubulars are great. They have good adjustability, they're strong, probably, and that's about it. These upper pieces are pretty stout as well, and there are a couple things we can do while we've got them apart to make them almost just as good as those aftermarket replacements for much, much less money. Obviously, we'll spin the new ball joint in there. That's great. But the important thing here is these bushings. These are called offset upper control arm bushings. They're made by Moog. I believe the part number is K7103. Yeah, you can actually get these on Amazon. If you ask me, this is an essential part of your Mopar front end rebuild. Ostensibly, these were designed to fix cars that have been wrecked. If the frame rails are tweaked a little bit and you can't quite get the thing into alignment, you can use these bushings to kick the control arm whichever way you need to go. You might only put one of these in one position on one control arm. For our purposes, we're going to use 4 of them. From the factory, these A-bodies had biased ply tires, and the alignment specs that were used to get those cars going straight down the road with those tires, completely different from what you want with modern radials. The factory alignment specs actually call for an asymmetrical setup. The camber settings are different from left to right to account for the crown and the road. But the big thing is the caster angle. That's the angle between your upper and lower ball joints. Positive caster is this. You want some positive caster. That helps your wheels snap back to center. The more positive caster you have, to a point, the nicer your car will feel going down the road. It'll be more solid. It will want to go straight. If you've driven many of these cars in their factory condition, you know that they tend to wander a little bit, and that's a big part of why. For handling purposes, we want to get a lot of caster. Something like 4 degrees positive caster, which again means the upper ball joint is 4 degrees behind the lower ball joint. But with factory suspension components, that's essentially impossible. And generally you'll find about 2, maybe 2.5 degrees is as much as you can get. 2 or 3 degrees of caster might not sound like a lot, but it really does make a big difference in the way your car drives. So we use these bushings to accomplish the improved caster angle. Because of the way the inner sleeve is offset from the outer sleeve, by installing this in a certain direction, you can move the entire control arm farther than you would be able to move it just with the cam bolts alone. Now there are diagrams available on the internet that will show you which way to point these bushings, and I recommend you refer to one of those. I recommend that because just about every time I've tried to do this, I've either screwed it up or almost screwed it up. The good thing is there's an arrow on this bushing, and that's telling you the direction the arm is moving when you install it that way. What we want again is for the upper ball joint to end up further behind the lower ball joint. This is the driver's side control arm. If you didn't know that, I'm certain it's the driver's side, you could just look at this lump for the droop stop. That's toward the front. So this is definitely the driver's side arm. Now we want the ball joint to go that way, right? So we're going to take our bushing and we're going to install it with the arrow pointing roughly that way. Now, how much offset you get exactly can vary based on how your ride height is set. In some cases, this arm will be drooped a little bit, so it might need to be like here. Oftentimes, it'll end up roughly flat, and that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to point the arrow roughly straight at the ball joint, and that should be pretty good. The rear bushing will get installed like this. Again, that'll mean the control arm is moving inward at the back, and it's moving outward at the front. That should get us all kinds of caster. Now, the other important measurement in your alignment is camber. That's the angle that the front wheel sits at. You can see camber from the front or the rear. Looking at the tire, it'll be tilted in for negative camber or out for positive camber. In these cars, we're going for about 0.5 degree of negative camber in most situations. You may be wondering if these offset bushings mess with the camber, but essentially what happens here is we're kicking the ball joint rearward, but by offsetting the control arm out here and in here, the ball joint essentially stays in the same line, if that makes sense. So you're still able to set the alignment, get the camber set right, but you have a better caster angle. Installed. I think I even did it right. Now you can use some kind of press tool, a socket and a big giant clamp. Personally, I just like slathering grease on stuff and smacking things with a hammer. So that's what I do for this. Set it down on a hard surface, and I use that socket, which perfectly fits around the rubber here on that lip. Get it started, and then pop it up on a bigger socket so it has somewhere to press into. And try not to do that. Anyway, they're in. I think they're right. And now I need to pop the washers in there. There's a big washer that goes on the outside and a smaller washer that goes on the inside of each bushing. And these are also a press fit, so that can take a bit of doing. Installing the outside washer with a hammer on the bench was easy enough. The inside one, not so much, so I just put it in the vise and cranked it down. There's that done. Definitely make sure these go all the way home or you'll have a tough time fitting this arm up into its sockets on the car. Even if they are all the way in, sometimes you gotta smack this with a hammer. Of course, I got everything finished, and then I remembered the little reinforcing sleeve that was on the rear bushing on both sides. So I pulled the washer back off and drove that home. And I'll tell you right now, it wasn't easy or fun, but I got it there. And now some rattle can blacks drying on it. Now I just have to do all that a second time. It's the next day, and well, it's been so long since I started this project, I don't know what I've demonstrated and what I haven't, but I wanted to show you this. This old sleeve, again with the reinforcing collar thing on the backside, didn't want to come out, and I really didn't want to beat on it and ruin this. So with the rubber removed, which was very easy, I just sliced this with a Sawzall, and it seriously just taps right out with a hammer and a pry bar. That ball joint almost went in too easily. Anyway, a bit more cleanup on this arm, a spritz of paint, and the upper arms are done. The paint's still drying on the passenger side arm, but the driver's side arm is on. The ball joint is torqued, the pin is in, and we're good to go there. So while I'm waiting for paint to dry on that other arm, I'm cleaning and painting the gearbox and getting ready to build out the steering. We have all new steering linkage for this car except for one thing, the center link. So I'm gonna have to disconnect that from all this old stuff, clean it up, paint it too, and then we'll be ready to reassemble. On the left there, you'll see the pitman arm. That's what comes off of the gearbox. This is the idler arm that secures the linkage over on the other side. And then you've got your tie rod assemblies. The front end rebuild kit we got came with new tie rods. I did insist on getting new sleeves as well. For one thing, they get all rusty and nasty, but also it'll be way easier to assemble with all new stuff. Popping the passenger side arm on now, and I've got an important note for you. These new ball joints ship with a washer to put under the castle nut. I wouldn't do that because essentially what happens is it drops the castle nut down enough that the cotter pin no longer wants to line up with the slot, and it makes installing it very, very hard. Of course, you want to have a cotter pin to lock this thing, and the factory didn't use washers. I did install it on the other side and barely got the pin through. I'm not going to bother over here. Steering gearbox installed. Well, today's supposed to be the big day. I want to get this suspension in and get the car moved. I kind of have an entire lift that needs to go here, so that needs to happen. Unfortunately, as you may notice, it's a little more spooky in the shop than usual because the power is out for some reason. So now I'm fumbling around in the dark looking for tie rod ends. Here we go. We've got all Moog parts here, but for some reason one is a different color. Neat. Anyway, if you don't know anything about tie rods, essentially you've got an inner and an outer tie rod end and a sleeve that connects them. Now on these cars, the inner and outer are essentially exactly the same. The only difference is one of them is reverse threaded where it goes into the sleeve. The reason for that is what you can do later to make alignment adjustments is loosen these two clamps and spin the sleeve because one is normal threaded and one is backwards threaded. Going this way will bring both in and going this way will bring both out, or vice versa. Because they're functionally equivalent, it really doesn't matter which one is inside or outside, the reverse threaded or the standard threaded one. I do normally try to put the standard threaded one on the outside, as I think that is correct, but it's not uncommon to see them backwards. Here's one complete tie rod assembly. Usually what I'll do is count the number of rotations on the old ends as I'm taking them out and then put the new ones in the same number of rotations. That way the length will be very close. What I'm doing here is building a completely new setup, so I don't have that. I put these in about 32 turns each. That's pretty close to the number of turns that were on the last several vehicles that I've done this on, so I figure that's a good starting point. Note, I've got roughly equivalent threads on both sides. This will definitely be adjusted once it goes on the car. You just want to get it close. If you're really concerned about this, you can try and measure center to center on the old tie rods and then match that. Yay, I can see again. Now I'm tearing everything off the center link so I can put the shiny new stuff on. Believe it or not, there are actually hex nuts in all this grime somewhere. This is really gnarly, actually. Really wish I'd filmed myself one-shotting every joint out of this center link. Oh well. Anyway, I'm gonna go clean this thing up because it's absolutely nasty, and then we can reassemble the steering. If you make your 50-year-old bench grinder completely unsafe and insane by OSHA's standards, it makes cleaning parts like this pretty easy, actually. Much better. I'm gonna spritz some paint on that real fast before putting all this back together. Otherwise, I'm confident it'll just flash rust. I've never noticed this before. This one's actually labeled gear on the gearbox end. I marked the taper there, not that you can see it, where I removed the pitman arm. It's not possible to install these upside down due to the taper, but that was a good catch. If you're not careful, you could flip it backwards, side for side, and that would be bad. It's some hours later, and the steering linkage is now together on this assembly. Of course, the idler arm is installed here. The new pitman arm is on, and of course these have wide teeth so they can only align in the correct direction. Or way, way off, I suppose. Now that I'm thinking about it, I didn't verify that the gearbox is centered, but it's pretty much impossible for it to get off by an entire tooth, so we should be good there. The tie rod ends, as you can see on that end, point upward. In here, they point downward. Everything is still loose at this point, it's just hanging together. This is good enough to get under the car and start mocking it all in place. I can't stress enough how nice it is doing this job like this compared to doing it under a car. So if you have the option to remove your K-frame and just do it all, yeah, do that. I did make one minor tactical error, which you may have even noticed. I forgot to press in the washers on the passenger side arm before I attached it to all of this. I could pull the pin, take the castle nut back off, separate that joint, take this over to the vise and do it, but instead, I've got the ball joint press, which I mentioned earlier. This is a great tool for doing these bushings if you have one. I'm using this to press those washers onto the bushing with it in situ. This is a very handy and versatile tool. You can actually use these to do U-joints as well. Oh, you can also rent these from O'Reilly and AutoZone. So at this point, we have a complete suspension and steering assembly. What we don't have is rotors, anything to mount a wheel to, brakes, brake brackets, backing plates, all of that stuff. So we're gonna get that wheel end stuff handled now before we roll this assembly under the car. To that end, we've got a set of freshly greased wheel bearings here, thanks to Alan. That's right, kept my hands clean. Those inner bearings get knocked into the back of these rotors, and then the inner seal goes over them. Now, of course, we're doing a disc brake swap as part of this, so we've got the new disc brake spindle on there. I've got to get a caliper bracket mounted on, which I believe goes like this. Something like that. Well, it's a while later. The caliper brackets are on and torqued. They're attached with these cap screws in this application. The shield is on there. They actually supplied these foams to go behind them. I did install them, and then I had a rubbing issue that turned out to be bolts I hadn't tightened. Anyway, I took those out. I've never installed them before, and I'm not too concerned now. Of course, I snugged down the hex nut here after installing the outer bearing, the washer in there. We did have a weird issue with the inner bearing not wanting to slide over the spindle there. I had to tap the rotor in with a dead blow. After I got it kind of sort of started, then it slid freely, so I don't know what the deal is there. Well, I do. New parts suck. I probably could address the spindle with some sandpaper if I'd realized that would be an issue, but it was kind of late by the time the inner bearings were already jammed on there. Anyway, they move freely now. Everything spins really nicely. So I snugged the nut down, installed a little castle lock piece, a cotter pin, and this cap, which of course I drove home with this. That's a ball joint spacer that fits perfectly. Now it's time to install the brakes. First, I need to fit this pad to the caliper. Of course, I've demonstrated this several times in the past. Happens to be worse on this one because that paint is all thick and this won't go where it goes. Anyway, you need to bang these tabs with a hammer so the pad fits tightly here. And in my case, I'm going to chisel off some paint. That's what you want to see. Nice snug fit under there. That pad will actually stay put and it shouldn't rattle around. That can get very annoying. This paint is killing me. It's super, super thick and it created an almost press fit on the caliper here. That's not good. The caliper has to be able to move back and forth. So now I get to bang it back out of there and sand those surfaces down. Alan points out that's probably powder coating. That's why it's so thick and gnarly. Again, great, but we do need these parts to actually fit together. That would be nice. Anyway, if you don't know, I did want to touch on this real fast. We've got the calipers mounted on the rear. You can actually mount them either way. The factory generally mounted them on the front. Unfortunately, if they're on the front, they're going to get in the way of your big gnarly aftermarket tubular sway bar. So we mounted them on the rear. Now this is interesting too. These calipers have dual bleeders, which I think means you can flip them side for side and point the hoses down or up. I can't remember what factory is. I'm gonna have to go look at another car. Looking at the disc brakes on my Charger, the hose is indeed on the top, so I'm gonna stick with that. Anyway, the point is, these ones apparently can go either direction. To change whether the calipers mount on the front or the back, you flip the spindle side for side because they're only drilled on one side. The caliper bracket comes with. The caliper also needs to be flipped side for side at that point. If you install an original front mounting caliper from the right, on the back on the right, the bleeder will be pointed downward. That is, of course, unless your caliper has dual bleeders, in which case, install it whatever way you want and use the upper bleeder to bleed the brakes. Having a jammed up fit between this and the bracket, preventing the caliper from sliding, well, that's a great way to make your pads wear asymmetrically and maybe start a brake fire. So that's a good tip for this project and for life. Check the fit of your parts when they're going together. Look for things like this. Much better. Oh, aftermarket replacement parts. This little shim thing is drilled wrong, I think, and these two pieces don't sit together. This is the slider for this slide type caliper. This design was used like into the 90s. In fact, the brakes on my ramp truck, very, very similar to this. With the brakes together and complete, we are ready to roll this thing under the car. Probably gonna have to suspend it from the ceiling again. That'll be fun. Okay, somehow I left the car at exactly the right height to get this back in. Easy, nobody breathe. We've got the K-frame in place and secured with the 4 gigantic 1/1/16 hex bolts. How you doing there, buddy?
Good.
Oh.
I'm good.
So, you gotta squish the shock and then jack up the lower control arm to get the shock in its home, which is kind of easier said than done right at the moment with this particular jack. Anyway, we'll get there eventually. Shock is stabbed in its home, and now the arm needs to go in. As mentioned, this will be a tight fit, and it'll probably involve a hammer to get it into position. After much swearing and love taps with a hammer, the control arm is roughly in place. Now we're going to install the cam bolts, which go inside and point outwards. The nuts end up out here. If you do it the other way, your alignment guy will hate you. Shock hardware installed. Of course, it's not tight. I don't know if I mentioned this or not, but we're actually removing this entire assembly again once this car is over on the other lift. We'll have the complete drivetrain built on it, and we're going to put the whole thing in the car from beneath, just like the factory did. For now, we're just throwing the suspension together to move it. There it is, kind of sort of assembled. Of course, these aren't final torqued either for obvious reasons, but everything is together. If you're doing this yourself, make sure you don't torque this hardware until you've got the car on the ground with the engine in, with all the weight on the suspension. You want your ride height set, and then you can torque your control arms, lower, upper, your strut rod, all that stuff. And with that, the suspension is attached to the car, which is awesome. Now the next step, if this was the final install, would be to knock the torsion bars in and then get them adjusted up. Also, a steering column might be nice, but I think we're probably just going to move this thing by kicking the tires. We do have an issue with the brake lines, actually. I installed them the same direction as the ones on the Charger. That's not going to work because the connection is here in the back. I don't really know if looping it out that way is going to make enough room either. It looks like most other angles I could put it at will send it into the shock as the cars turn. So what I may do is flip the caliper side for side to get those line connections on the bottom. I don't know. We'll deal with this later. Obviously, we're not plumbing or bleeding brakes today. Now, the big question is if these giant front tires are going to fit at all with no torsion bar and the car sitting on the bump stops. Let's find out. And just like that, it's magically on its wheels and down on the ground for the first time. Note, because we have no torsion bars, when we first set it down, it went all the way on the bump stops, and it turns out these gigantic tires on these gigantic Krager wheels kind of sort of contact the passenger fender. The driver's side didn't hit, but the passenger side did. You definitely couldn't steer it like that, and the passenger side wouldn't even roll. So now we've got a 1x up over the bump stops, holding it up roughly to ride height, and it looks pretty nice. We're still gonna have to deal with this, either space the bump stop or change the wheels or the tires. Of course, these wheels were never intended to be permanent anyway, but yeah, it's kind of cool. Again, assuming you get your torsion bars installed and get to ride height, at this point, you're gonna wanna torque everything you've got down there. You wanna get this thing kind of sort of eyeballed close to an alignment, and then I can only assume you'll be taking it over to an alignment shop. Unless you want to attempt it at home with like a measuring tape and a stick and a level or whatever, that's up to you. That's just about it for your Mopar front end overhaul. Now again, this is going to be the same for any A body, essentially any B body, at least before 1973, and even C bodies are, well, kind of similar. Not that similar now that I think about it. With all that taken care of, we get to drag this thing out into the rain with the ramp truck and dump a lift right here, so that's this whole other thing. For now, that's it on the Dart Sport. Next time you see this, we'll be putting like a Dana 60 in the rear end and maybe a drivetrain, but we'll see. If you have any questions on how to rebuild the suspension in your Mopar, feel free to drop them in the comments. I do read all of those. In any case, as ever, thank you very much for watching. And remember, old Mopars don't die. They just smell that way sometimes. Stay